A boy runs into the hospital carrying a baby in his arms. The reason brings even the doctor to tears. The July sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Millbrook, Connecticut, turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. Mateo Sanchez, a 10-year-old boy with unruly black hair and curious hazel eyes, pedaled his battered bicycle down Maple Avenue, dodging sweat puddles that the heat pulled from the pavement. "Mateo, don't go too far," shouted his mother, Elena, from the doorway of the small apartment they shared on the second floor of a red brick building. Elena, with her apron still on and her hair tied in a tight bun, watched her son with a mix of pride and concern. "And don't forget your water bottle." Mateo waved his hand to show he had heard, but his mind was already elsewhere. Oak Grove Park called to him like an oasis in the middle of the urban desert. There, under the shade of ancient oaks, he could escape the stifling heat and maybe find some friends to play soccer with. As he pedaled, Mateo couldn't help but notice how the shutters on the houses were drawn like heavy eyelids, shielding themselves from the relentless sun. The streets were almost deserted except for a brave few walking their dogs or rushing toward the safety of air conditioning. When he reached the park, Mateo dropped his bike next to a bench and headed for the water fountain. The cool water momentarily eased the heat he felt, but it couldn't extinguish the spark of disappointment at seeing the park nearly empty. No sign of his usual friends. "I guess I'll have to settle for my own company today," he murmured to himself, kicking a solitary stone. That's when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from the parking lot across the street. Mateo strained his ears, intrigued. The sound repeated, clearer this time. It was the cry of a baby. With his heart beating a little faster, Mateo crossed the street, his eyes scanning the small parking lot. There were only 3 cars, all locked and seemingly empty under the scorching sun, but the crying continued, growing weaker. He approached an old blue Chevrolet, the only one with the windows slightly open. The heat radiating from the car was suffocating, even from outside. Mateo stood on tiptoes to peer through the rear window, and what he saw chilled his blood despite the heat. In a baby seat, a small creature no more than 6 months old weakly squirmed. Her face was red and covered in sweat, her movements increasingly sluggish. Mateo looked around desperately for help, but the street remained empty. "Hello? Is anyone there?" he shouted with all his might, but only the echo of his own voice answered. Time seemed to stand still. Mateo knew he had to act fast. Without thinking twice, he grabbed a stone from the ground and, with all the strength he could muster, smashed it against the car's rear window. The glass shattered, superficially cutting Mateo's hand, but he barely noticed. Carefully avoiding further injury, Mateo managed to open the door from the inside. A wave of hot air hit him along with the now louder cries of the baby. With trembling but determined hands, he unbuckled the seatbelt and lifted the little girl out. She was burning up. Her normally soft skin felt like sandpaper under Mateo's touch. The boy looked around once more, hoping against all odds that someone, an adult who knew what to do, would appear, but they were still alone. "Hang in there, little one," Mateo whispered, though his own voice trembled. "I'm going to get you out of here." Without thinking further, Mateo started running. He knew that Millbrook General Hospital was only a few blocks away. He had passed by it many times on his bike but had never gone inside. Now, with the baby in his arms, every step felt like an eternity. The asphalt burned under his worn-out sneakers and sweat blurred his vision, but Mateo didn't stop. The little girl in his arms had almost stopped crying, and that scared him more than anything. "Hold on, please," Mateo panted as he ran. "We're almost there." The people he passed stared at him in astonishment and confusion, but Mateo didn't have time to explain. His world had shrunk to his moving legs and the precious bundle in his arms. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the glass doors of the hospital appeared in front of him. With one last effort, Mateo burst into the emergency room, the cool indoor air hitting him like a wave. "I help," he shouted with the last of his strength. "Please, help her." The hospital staff reacted immediately. A nurse took the baby from Mateo's arms while another led him to a chair. Dr. Robert Thompson, who happened to be nearby, quickly joined the team attending to the little girl. "What happened?" Thompson asked, his blue eyes quickly assessing the situation. Between gasps, Mateo managed to explain what had happened. "Doctor," Thompson's face hardened as he listened to the baby being abandoned in the car, but his hands worked with precision and calm. "You did the right thing, kid," the doctor said, his voice mixing professionalism with an emotion he couldn't completely hide. "You probably saved her life." While the medical team worked frantically to stabilize the baby, Matteo sank into the chair, exhaustion and adrenaline finally taking their toll. He looked at his trembling hands, noticing the cuts from the broken glass for the first time. A nurse came over to treat his wounds, but Matteo barely noticed her. His eyes were fixed on the door through which they had taken the baby, his mind replaying the events of the last few hours. "Will she be okay?" Matteo asked, his voice barely a whisper. The nurse smiled kindly as she cleaned his cuts. "Thanks to you, she has a good chance. You're a real hero, you know." Matteo didn't feel like a hero. He felt small, scared, and very, very tired. But he also felt something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if, in that moment, he had discovered a part of himself he didn't know existed. As the activity around him continued, Matteo closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the hospital envelop him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew nothing would ever be the same again. In that sweltering summer day in Millbrook, Connecticut, Matteo Sanchez's life had changed forever. The constant hum of machines and the comings and goings of medical staff set the rhythm in the emergency room at Millbrook General Hospital. Matteo, seated in an uncomfortable plastic chair, kept his gaze fixed on the door where Dr. Thompson and the baby had disappeared. His bandaged hands rested on his trembling knees. "Matteo Sanchez," called a firm but kind voice. The boy looked up to meet a middle-aged woman with brown hair pulled back into a tight bun and piercing eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. She wore a gray pantsuit and held a folder in her hands. "I'm the social worker, Sarah Collins," she introduced herself, sitting next to Matteo. "Do you mind if we talk for a moment?" Matteo nodded silently, his throat suddenly dry. "What you did today was very brave," Sarah began, her voice softening. "But I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail is important." As Matteo recounted the events of the afternoon, Sarah took notes, occasionally nodding. Her professional expression only broke for a moment when Matteo described how he broke the car window. "You know that's technically illegal?" Sarah asked, though her tone lacked reproach. Matteo felt his heart race. I just wanted to help," he stammered, fear coloring his voice. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know, Matteo, and you did the right thing. But this complicates things a little. Do your parents know you're here?" Matteo's face paled. Amid the chaos, he had completely forgotten about his parents. "No, my mom thinks I'm at the park," he replied, guilt evident in his voice. Sarah sighed, pulling out her phone. "We need to contact them immediately. Can you give me their number?" While Sarah stepped away to make the call, Matteo felt the weight of his actions begin to settle on his shoulders. What would his parents say? Would they get in trouble for what he had done? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Thompson, who emerged from the treatment room with an expression of exhaustion but relief on his face. "The baby is stable," he announced, addressing both Matteo and Sarah, who had just returned. "She has a severe case of hyperthermia, but she got here just in time. A few more hours in that car." His voice trailed off, the implication clear to all. Matteo felt a knot in his chest loosen slightly. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Thompson looked at Sarah, who nodded slightly. "And only for a moment," the doctor agreed. "She's in the neonatal intensive care unit." Following Dr. Thompson through the hospital corridors, Matteo felt as if he were in a dream. The smell of disinfectant and the muffled sound of conversations and machines created a surreal atmosphere. The neonatal intensive care unit was a world apart. Incubators and monitors occupied most of the space, each housing a small fighter. Dr. Thompson led Matteo to a particular incubator, where the baby he had rescued lay. She looked so small and fragile, connected to tubes and wires. Her skin, once red and irritated, now had a healthier tone. Matteo placed his bandaged hand on the plastic of the incubator as if wanting to touch her. "She's a fighter," Dr. Thompson remarked softly. "Thanks to you, she has a chance." Matteo couldn't hold back the tears that had been threatening to fall since he arrived at the hospital. How could someone leave her like that?" he sobbed. Dr. Thompson placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. "Sometimes people make desperate decisions when they're in desperate situations. But the important thing is that she's safe now. The moment was interrupted by the hurried arrival of Elena and Carlos Sanchez, Mateo's parents. Elena, with red, tearful eyes, rushed to her son, enveloping him in a fierce embrace. "My boy, thank God you're okay," she exclaimed, alternating between kisses and scolding in rapid Spanish. Carlos, for his part, stayed a step back, his face a mix of relief and concern. His eyes darted nervously between his son and the adults present. Sarah approached, her expression professional but understanding. "Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez, I'm Sarah Collins, a social worker. We need to talk about what happened today." Carlos's face visibly tensed. "Is Mateo in trouble?" he asked, his accent more pronounced due to stress. "Not exactly," Sarah replied, choosing her words carefully. "But the situation is complicated." As the group moved to a private conference room, Mateo couldn't help but notice how his father walked with his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. The worried expression on his mother's face made his stomach twist with guilt. In the conference room, Sarah explained the situation in detail, from Mateo's discovery to the baby's current condition. Elena sobbed quietly while Carlos listened with an increasingly grim expression. "Mateo acted heroically," Sarah concluded. "But the fact is there was damage to private property, and the police will need to speak with him as a key witness." Carlos stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "No," he said firmly. "We won't talk to the police." The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Sarah looked at Carlos with a mix of understanding and frustration. "Mr. Sanchez, I understand your concern, but—" "No, you don't understand," Carlos interrupted, his voice trembling slightly. "Our situation here is complicated." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. "Oh," she said softly. "I see." Mateo looked confused between his father and Sarah. "What's going on, Dad?" he asked. Elena took her son's hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Son, there are things we haven't told you about how we came to this country." The revelation hit Mateo like a bucket of cold water. His parents, the people he admired most in the world, were undocumented. Suddenly, many things made sense. Why his father worked so many different jobs. Why his mother always seemed nervous when she saw a police car. Why they had never visited family in Mexico. But I was born here," Mateo stammered, trying to process the information. "Yes, my love," Elena replied, stroking his cheek. "You are a citizen. But we—" Sarah cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "This complicates things," she admitted. "But Mateo is a hero. He saved a life today. There must be a way to handle this without putting his family at risk." While the adults discussed possible solutions, Mateo felt as if the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his family, was changing. And all because of a decision made in a moment of crisis. The sound of a commotion outside the room interrupted the discussion. Through the window, they could see a group of reporters and cameramen in the hallway, trying to get information about the hero boy everyone was talking about. "This is getting out of control," Sarah murmured, massaging her temples. At that moment, Dr. Thompson entered the room hurriedly, his face a mix of excitement and concern. "We have news," he announced. "The police found the baby's mother." Everyone turned to him expectantly. "She's a 19-year-old young woman," Dr. Thompson continued, "and they found her unconscious in an alley near the park. Apparently, she's a drug addict and overdosed shortly after, abandoning the baby." The news dropped like a bomb in the room. Elena crossed herself, murmuring a prayer in Spanish. Carlos clenched his fists, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Sarah seemed to be quickly processing the legal and social implications of this new information. Mateo, for his part, felt a surge of emotions he couldn't name. Anger at the mother who had abandoned her baby, compassion for the young woman clearly struggling with her own demons, fear for what this would mean for his family. "What happens now?" Mateo asked, his voice small in the tension-filled room. Sarah was the one to answer, her voice professional but kind. "It's complicated, Mateo. The baby will need a safe place while her mother receives treatment. And you, well, you're a key witness in a case that now involves child abandonment and substance abuse." Carlos stood up again, his face a mask of determination. "No," he said firmly. We won't expose Matteo to that. We'll find another way. Dad, Matteo intervened, surprising everyone with the firmness in his voice. I did the right thing. We can't hide now. Elena sobbed softly, hugging her son. Am I brave, my hero? She murmured into his hair. Dr. Thompson, who had been quietly observing the scene, stepped forward. Maybe, he began slowly. There's a way to handle this that protects everyone involved. All eyes turned to him, a mix of hope and skepticism on their faces. Matteo's story is powerful, Dr. Thompson continued. It shows the best of our community, of humanity. If we handle it correctly, it could be an opportunity for change, not just for the baby and her mother, but for families like yours, Mr. Sanchez. Sarah nodded slowly, beginning to see the direction of the doctor's thoughts. A story of compassion and heroism could change the narrative, she reflected. But we would have to be very careful. As the adults began to discuss strategies and possibilities, Matteo found himself looking out the window at the hustle and bustle of the hospital. Somewhere in that maze of hallways and rooms, a little baby was fighting for her life. A young mother was facing her demons, and his own family's future hung in the balance. Matteo didn't fully understand all the complexities of the situation, but he knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. His actions had created ripples in the pond of his small community, and those ripples would continue to expand in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the sun began to set outside the hospital window, Matteo realized that this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The next morning dawned with deceptive calm in Millbrook. The sun lazily rose over the rooftops of the small town, bathing the streets in a golden light that seemed to promise a new beginning. But for Matteo Sanchez and his family, the storm was just beginning. In the kitchen of their modest apartment, Elena Sanchez mechanically prepared breakfast, her mind clearly elsewhere. Carlos, seated at the table with an untouched cup of coffee in front of him, nervously scrolled through his phone. Matteo, for his part, picked at his plate of scrambled eggs, the knot in his stomach making each bite a challenge. The heavy, tension-laden silence was broken by the shrill sound of the phone. Carlos started, spilling some of his coffee before answering with trembling hands. Yes, I understand. We'll be there, he said before hanging up, his voice a hoarse whisper. Elena turned to him, the silent question in her eyes. It was the social worker, Sarah, Carlos explained, running a hand over his tired face. They want us to go to the hospital. Apparently, the story has leaked to the press. Matteo felt his heart race. What does that mean, Dad? Carlos looked at his son, his eyes a mix of pride and concern. It means things are going to change, son. For better or for worse. The trip to the hospital was tense and silent. The normally quiet streets of Millbrook buzzed with unusual activity. Local news vans lined up outside the hospital, reporters with microphones in hand eagerly awaiting the next scoop. Keep your head down, Matteo, instructed Elena as they made their way through the crowd. At the hospital reception, they were greeted by Sarah Collins, in whose face showed signs of a sleepless night. Thank you for coming so quickly, she said, guiding them to a private conference room. The situation has evolved. In the room, they found Dr. Thompson in a heated discussion with a man in a suit that Matteo didn't recognize. When the Sanchez family entered, both men fell abruptly silent. The Sanchez family, said the man in the suit, approaching with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I'm Richard Hawkins, legal advisor for the hospital. We have a lot to discuss. Over the next hour, Matteo listened in a state of bewilderment as his simple act of kindness had become the center of a media and legal whirlwind. The story of the immigrant hero boy had captured national attention, sparking debates on immigration, healthcare, and social services. The governor has expressed interest in the case, Hawkins explained, his voice a professional monotone. They see an opportunity for a public relations victory. They're considering using executive powers to grant temporary legal status to the Sanchez family. Carlos and Elena exchanged looks of astonishment and caution. And what about the baby? Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Thompson spoke, his voice softening. Sophia, as we've temporarily named her, is improving, but her situation is complicated. Sarah took over, her tone professional but compassionate. Sophia's mother, Amber Johnson, is currently in rehab. She has expressed remorse for her actions and wishes to regain custody eventually, but the process will be long and difficult. Matteo, who had been listening in silence, finally spoke. Can I see her? Sophia, the adults exchanged glances, but it was Dr. Thompson who nodded. I think that would be good for both of you. As Matteo followed Dr. Thompson to the neonatal unit, he could feel the tension in the air like static electricity before a storm. The hospital corridors were unusually crowded, with staff and visitors whispering and discreetly pointing at the hero boy. In the NICU, Sophia lay in her incubator, her small body still connected to several monitors but noticeably stronger than the day before. Matteo placed his hand on the plastic, watching as the baby's chest rose and fell with each breath. Hello, Sophia, Matteo whispered. It's me, the boy who... Well, Dr. Thompson watched the scene with a mix of emotion and concern. You've formed a special bond with her, haven't you? He asked softly. Matteo nodded, not taking his eyes off Sophia. It's like she's my responsibility, I can't explain it. The doctor placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. I understand. But remember, Matteo, that there are many people involved in this situation. People who will make decisions that affect Sophia's future. Before Matteo could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught his attention. Through the NICU window, he could see a group of people moving quickly. In the center of the group was a young woman with disheveled blonde hair and sunken eyes, walking with determination. It's her, Dr. Thompson murmured, visibly tensing. Amber Johnson, Sophia's mother. Matteo felt his heart race. This was the woman who had abandoned Sophia in that hot car. The woman whose actions had triggered all of this. And now she was here, just a few feet away. Amber entered the NICU, her eyes fixed on the incubator where Sophia lay. For a moment, she seemed not to notice anyone else in the room. Then her gaze fell on Matteo. You, she said, her voice hoarse and heavy with emotion. You're the boy who saved her. Matteo nodded, unable to form words. The air in the room seemed to have thickened, charged with unspoken emotions. Amber took a step toward Matteo, and for a moment, the boy feared she might attack him. But instead, Amber fell to her knees, tears streaming down her cheeks. Thank you, she sobbed, grasping Matteo's hand. Thank you for saving my baby, for doing what I couldn't. The scene was interrupted by the hurried arrival of Sarah, followed closely by Matteo's parents and several hospital security officers. Amber, said Sarah, her voice firm but kind. You shouldn't be here. There's a process we need to follow. Amber stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I know, but I had to see her. I had to thank this boy. Carlos approached Matteo, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Son, are you okay? He asked quietly. Matteo nodded, though his mind was spinning. Seeing Amber, hearing her gratitude and her pain, had added a new layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Dr. Thompson intervened, his voice calm but authoritative. I think we all need a moment to calm down. I suggest we meet in the conference room to discuss this in a civilized manner. As the group made their way to the conference room, Matteo couldn't help but notice the curious glances and whispers of hospital staff and visitors. The news of his heroic act had spread like wildfire, and now it seemed that everyone in Millbrook had an opinion on the case of the hero boy and the abandoned baby. In the conference room, the tension was palpable. Amber sat in a corner, flanked by Sarah and a man who introduced himself as her lawyer. The Sanchez family clustered on the opposite side of the table, with Matteo between his parents. Dr. Thompson and Richard Hawkins occupied the center, acting as impromptu mediators in this unfolding drama. All right, Hawkins began, clearing his throat. Oh, we're here to discuss Sophia's future and, by extension, the future of all the people involved in this extraordinary situation. Sarah took over, her tone professional but compassionate. Amber has expressed her desire to regain custody of Sophia once she completes her rehabilitation program. However, given the nature of what happened, the process will be long and subject to strict supervision. Amber, her eyes red but determined, spoke. I know I made a terrible mistake. I was in a very dark place. But I'm committed to changing, to being the mother that Sophia deserves. Elena, who had been listening in silence, leaned forward, And what guarantee do we have that she won't hurt her again? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. The question dropped like a bomb in the room. Amber paled while her lawyer rushed to intervene. My client is following all the necessary steps for her recovery. It's not fair to judge her by her past actions when she's doing everything she can to change. Carlos Waum, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a calm but firm voice. We understand the desire for a second chance. We ourselves came to this country seeking one, but the child's safety must be the priority. The discussion continued, with arguments and counter-arguments flying across the table. Mateo watched in silence, feeling smaller and more overwhelmed by the minute. How had it come to this? Just 2 days ago, his biggest concern had been finding someone to play soccer with at the park. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted the heated debate. Thompson's ear. The doctor's face shifted from surprise to concern in a matter of seconds. Everyone, Dr. Thompson said, standing up. It seems we have a situation developing outside. They all rushed to the windows of the conference room, which overlooked the hospital's main entrance. What they saw took their breath away. A crowd had gathered outside the hospital. Hundreds of people held signs and chanted slogans. Some supported the Hero immigrant family, others called for justice for Amber, and a third group advocated for Sophia's rights above all else. This has gotten out of control, Hawkins murmured, pulling out his phone to make frantic calls. Mateo watched the scene with a mix of awe and horror. Was all this because of him? Because of his decision to help a baby in danger? It was then that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Among the crowd, he saw several of his classmates, including his best friend, Jason, and standing next to Jason, holding a sign that read, "Deport the illegals," was Jason's father, a man who had always been kind to Mateo. The reality of the situation hit Mateo with full force. This was no longer just about him and Sophia. It had become something much bigger, something that was dividing his community, pitting friends against friends, neighbors against neighbors. "Mom, Dad," Mateo said, his voice barely a whisper. What have we done?" Elena hugged her son, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Carlos, for his part, stared out the window with a look of determination. "We did what was right, son," Carlos replied. "And now we have to face the consequences." Dr. Thompson turned to the group, his face grave. "I think it's time to make some difficult decisions. This situation is affecting not only Sophia and our families, but the entire community of Millbrook." Sarah nodded, pulling a folder from her briefcase. "I have several legal options here that we can consider. But before we get into the details, I think we all need to take a moment to reflect on what we really want for Sophia and for ourselves." Amber, who had been watching the scene outside with an expression of guilt and horror, turned to the group. I never wanted this to happen. I just wanted a chance to be a good mother." Mateo, feeling a surge of emotion he couldn't explain, walked over to Amber and took her hand. "And you deserve that chance," he said, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. But Sophia deserves to be safe and loved no matter what." Mateo's gesture seemed to break something in the room. Suddenly, the dividing lines that had been so clear moments before began to blur. Elena offered Amber a tissue. Carlos and Amber's lawyer began talking quietly, seeking common ground. As the adults started discussing possible solutions, Mateo found himself looking out the window again. The crowd outside was still growing, but now he noticed something different. On the edges, he saw small groups of people from both sides talking to each other, some even hugging. It was as if the chaos had reached a tipping point, and now slowly the pendulum was beginning to swing toward mutual understanding. It was in that moment that Mateo had an epiphany. He turned to the group of adults still heatedly debating. "Wait," he exclaimed, his voice stronger than it had ever been. Everyone stopped, surprised by the sudden intervention of the boy. "I think we're all forgetting something important," Mateo continued, his heart pounding but his voice clear. "This isn't about us, it's about Sophia, and all the other Sophias that might be out there." The silence that followed was profound. Encouraged by everyone's attention, Mateo pressed on. "Yes, I saved Sophia that day. But what if there are other children in danger that we don't see? What if there are other mothers like Amber who need help before they reach that point?" Amber sobbed softly, but there was a spark of something new in her eyes. "Hope. Maybe," Mateo continued, looking at each adult in the room. Instead of fighting over who's right, we should think about how we can help make sure this doesn't happen again. Doctor. Thompson was the first to break the silence that followed. "The boy's right," he said, a smile of admiration on his face. "We've been so focused on this particular case that we lost sight of the bigger picture." Sarah nodded, quickly flipping through her notes. "And we could propose a pilot program, something that combines health services, addiction support, and legal assistance for at-risk families. And education," added Elena, her voice soft but firm. "Education about immigrant rights and the resources available to them." Carlos, who had been listening intently, cleared his throat. "If our story can help others, I'm willing to share it. Maybe it's time we stopped hiding and started fighting for real change." Amber's lawyer, who had maintained a defensive posture until now, leaned forward with interest. "We could use this case as a catalyst for legislative change. There's precedent for high-profile cases leading to significant reforms." As the adults began drafting a plan of action, Matteo felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Amber, her eyes still wet but with a new determination in them. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for saving Sophia, but for reminding all of us why you did it in the first place." Matteo nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since all this began, he felt that things might actually get better. The rest of the afternoon passed in a whirlwind of activity. Calls were made, proposals were drafted, and plans were outlined. News of the Sophia Initiative, as they had named it, leaked to the press, and soon the crowd outside the hospital began changing their protest chants into cheers of support. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, painting the sky in warm tones, Matteo found himself once again in the NICU next to Sophia's incubator. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Beside him were his parents, Amber, Dr. Thompson, and Sarah. "You know, Doctor," Thompson said, breaking the contemplative silence. "In medicine, we talk a lot about the butterfly effect, the idea that a small change can have enormous, unforeseen consequences." Matteo nodded, remembering learning about it in school. "Wait, but what we often forget," the doctor continued, "is that those effects can be positive. Your act of kindness, Matteo, didn't just save Sophia. It set something much bigger in motion." Elena hugged her son, pride evident on her face. "My little hero," she murmured. Carlos, for his part, looked at his family, then at Amber, who was watching Sophia with a mix of love and determination. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've all been heroes today. And tomorrow, we'll have to be heroes again." As the group watched Sophia, who slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil she had caused, Matteo reflected on the events of the past few days. It had all started as a simple act of kindness, an instinct to help someone in danger. And now, somehow, it had become the catalyst for a movement that could change lives. "Dr. Thompson," Matteo asked, a question forming in his mind, "do you think Sophia will remember any of this when she grows up?" The doctor smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Probably not, Matteo, but that doesn't matter. Because thanks to you, thanks to all of us, she'll grow up in a slightly better world. And that, my young friend, is the greatest legacy anyone can leave." As night fell over Millbrook, a sense of hope and possibility hung in the air. The storm had passed, at least for now, and in its wake it had left the promise of a new dawn. A dawn where the actions of a brave boy had reminded an entire community of the power of compassion, unity, and positive change. Matteo looked at Sophia one last time before the group prepared to leave. "Sweet dreams, little one," he whispered. "The world is waiting for you." The following days in Millbrook passed in a whirlwind of activity. The small Connecticut town, which had until recently been little more than a footnote on the map, had become the epicenter of a national debate on immigration, healthcare, and social responsibility. Mateo Sanchez, the boy whose act of bravery had sparked it all, found himself at the center of a media hurricane. TV cameras and reporters camped outside his modest apartment building, hoping to catch a glimpse of the little hero. "I don't understand why they're so interested in me," Mateo murmured to his mother one morning as they peeked through the window. "I just did what anyone would have done." Elena hugged her son, kissing his forehead. "That's exactly why they're interested, son. because you did the right thing without thinking twice. That's rare and special. Meanwhile, at Millbrook General Hospital, the Sophia Initiative was taking shape rapidly. Dr. Thompson, along with Sarah Collins and a team of public health and social work experts, worked tirelessly to turn the idea born in a moment of crisis into a viable program. The key, Dr. Thompson explained in a meeting, is prevention, identifying families at risk before they reach a critical situation like Amber and Sophia's. Sarah nodded, adding, "And for that, we need the community's cooperation. We can't do this alone." The Millbrook community, for its part, was responding in surprising ways. What had started as division was quickly becoming a unified effort. Local churches organized food and clothing drives for families in need. Business owners offered jobs to immigrants who had previously feared being hired. Even the local police station had announced new cultural sensitivity training policies. Amid all this, Amber Johnson, Sophia's mother, was facing her own journey of redemption. Every day after her therapy sessions and Narcotics Anonymous meetings, she visited her daughter at the hospital. "It's hard," she confessed to Matteo during one of these visits. The boy had made it a habit to stop by the hospital after school to check on Sophia. "There are days when I just want to give up. But then I look at her and I know I have to be strong for her." Matteo, with wisdom beyond his years, took Amber's hand. "My dad says being strong doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Amber smiled through her tears. "Your dad is a wise man." Speaking of Carlos Sanchez, Mateo's father had become an unexpected figure in the local immigration reform movement. His story, that of a man who had risked everything for a better future for his family, resonated deeply within the community. "We didn't come here to cause trouble," he said at a town council meeting that had gone viral on social media. "We came to work hard, to contribute, to be part of this great nation. And I think what my son did shows that we are part of this community, that we care about our neighbors no matter where they come from." His speech was met with a standing ovation, even from those who had previously been vocal in their opposition to undocumented immigration. As the weeks passed, the changes in Millbrook became increasingly evident. The hospital had established a mobile clinic that traveled to the neediest neighborhoods, offering free checkups and advice on social services. Mateo's school had launched a peer mentoring program, pairing immigrant students with local peers to help with language and cultural integration. But perhaps the most significant change was seen in the people themselves. Neighbors who had once barely greeted each other now stopped to chat, sharing stories and offering help. The distrust and fear that had divided the community were gradually being replaced by a sense of unity and shared purpose. A month after the incident that had started it all, Mateo found himself once again in the hospital's NICU. This time, however, it was a special occasion. Sophia, now strong and healthy, was ready to be discharged. "Are you ready for this, Dr. Thompson asked Amber, who held her daughter with a mix of love and nervousness. Amber looked around at the smiling faces of Mateo and his parents, of Sarah, of Dr. Thompson, and of the hospital staff she had come to know so well. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "But I know I'm not alone." As the group prepared to accompany Amber and Sophia to their new home, an apartment provided by a transitional housing program, Mateo reflected on all that had changed in such a short time. "You know," he said to no one in particular, "when I found Sophia in that car, I thought I was saving a life. But I think I was actually saving a whole community." Elena hugged her son, tears shining in her eyes. "And in the process, son, you saved all of us." As they left the hospital, they were greeted by a small crowd of well-wishers. Neighbors, Mateo's classmates, even the mayor of Millbrook were there to celebrate this new beginning. Mateo looked around at the smiling, hopeful faces and felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just happiness, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was something deeper, more enduring. It was the feeling that, despite all the challenges still ahead, Millbrook had found something precious. A sense of community, of belonging, of home. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness. The afternoon sun bathed Oak Grove Park in a golden glow, illuminating a scene that 6 months ago would have seemed improbable, if not impossible. Families of diverse backgrounds gathered to celebrate Millbrook Unity Day, a new festival commemorating the transformation of the small Connecticut town. At the center of it all, next to a modest makeshift stage, was Mateo Sanchez. The 11-year-old, he had celebrated his birthday the previous month, looked noticeably uncomfortable with all the attention, but his face lit up when he saw a familiar figure approaching. "Sophia," he exclaimed, extending his arms toward the baby that Amber Johnson proudly held. The little girl, now almost 9 months old, gurgled happily at the sight of Mateo. "I can't believe how big she's gotten," Mateo commented, gently tickling Sophia. Amber smiled, the exhaustion in her eyes mixed with undeniable determination. "She's growing faster than I can keep up with," she said. "But every day is a gift." The sound of a microphone being tested drew everyone's attention to the stage. The mayor of Millbrook, a middle-aged man with a genuine smile, cleared his throat. "Welcome, friends and neighbors, to the first Millbrook Unity Day," he began. "About 6 months ago, our community was divided, fearful, and distrustful. Today, we come together as a family, stronger and more united than ever." As the mayor continued his speech, Mateo looked around. He saw his parents, Elena and Carlos, standing next to Dr. Thompson and Sarah Collins. He saw his classmates mingling freely with children who had once been considered different or outsiders. He saw former opponents of immigration chatting amicably with newly arrived families. And all of this, the mayor continued, started with the brave act of a child who reminded us that compassion knows no borders, that kindness requires no documents, and that a single act of love can change the world. "Mateo Sanchez, would you join me on stage?" With a gentle nudge from his mother, Mateo timidly climbed onto the stage, his cheeks reddening at the applause from the crowd. "Mateo," the mayor said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, "on behalf of the entire city of Millbrook, I want to thank you, not only for saving Sophia's life, but for saving all of us from our own prejudices and fears." The mayor turned to the audience. The Sophia Initiative, inspired by Mateo's actions, has helped over 100 families in the past 6 months. We've seen a 30% decrease in child neglect cases, a 50% increase in participation in addiction treatment programs, and an incredible 75% increase in community volunteerism. The applause that followed echoed through the park, but Mateo barely heard it. His mind was on that hot summer day, on the decision he made without a second thought. How could he have imagined the consequences of that simple act? "And now," the mayor continued, "I have the honor of announcing that the City Council has unanimously voted to rename this park. From today on, it will be known as Sanchez Hope Park, in honor of the family that taught us the true meaning of community." The ovation that followed was deafening. Elena and Carlos embraced, tears freely streaming down their faces. Amber, still holding Sophia, joined in the applause enthusiastically. When the noise finally subsided, the mayor offered Mateo the microphone. "Would you like to say a few words?" Mateo looked nervously at the crowd, then at his parents, who encouraged him with a smile. Taking a deep breath, he accepted the microphone. I'm not a hero," he began, faltering. "I just did what I thought was right. But I've learned that sometimes doing the right thing can be hard. It can be scary, but it can also change things in ways we never imagined." He paused, searching for the right words. "And when I saved Sophia, I wasn't thinking about politics or changing the community. I just knew someone needed help. And I think that's something we can all do. We don't have to save babies from hot cars every day. Sometimes helping can be as simple as smiling at a stranger, standing up for someone being treated unfairly, or just being there for a friend who needs it." Mateo looked directly at the audience, his voice gaining strength. "My dad always says we're stronger together, and I think Millbrook has shown that's true. So thank you, not for honoring me or my family, but for showing that when we come together, when we care for each other no matter where we come from, we can do amazing things." The silence that followed Mateo's words was deep, filled with emotion. Then, like a wave, the applause began, growing into a roar of approval and affirmation. As Mateo stepped off the stage, he was immediately enveloped in a group hug by his family: Amber, Sophia, Dr. Thompson, and Sarah. Tears mixed with laughter, the joy of the moment tempered by the understanding of the long road they had traveled. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Mateo found himself sitting on a bench in the park, watching the community he had helped transform. Dr. Thompson joined him, offering him a glass of lemonade. "You know, Matteo," the doctor said after a moment of contemplative silence, "in medicine we often talk about healing. But what you've done here, what we've all done together, goes beyond healing. You've helped create something new and beautiful out of something that could have been tragic." Matteo nodded, thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at the park that day, if I hadn't heard Sophia." "Doctor," Thompson smiled. "That's the power of an act of kindness, Matteo. We never really know how far its impact will reach. It's like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has disappeared beneath the surface." As the sun began to set, tinting the sky with warm hues, Matteo reflected on the doctor's words. His simple decision to help had set off a chain of events that had changed not only his life, but the lives of an entire community. And as he watched Sophia laugh in Amber's arms, his parents chatting animatedly with neighbors who had once viewed them with suspicion, former rivals sharing food and laughter, Matteo understood a profound truth. The true power of change doesn't lie in grand gestures or heroic actions, but in the small acts of kindness and compassion that each of us can perform every day. The echo of his act of kindness would continue to resonate, inspiring others to open their hearts and reach out to those in need. And in that echo, in those ripples that kept spreading, Matteo saw the true meaning of heroism and the promise of a brighter, more united future for everyone.